Welcome to the Ultimate Royal Court Critique. This is a video essay that analyzes all aspects of the Royal Court DLC for Crusader Kings 3 in a precise yet concise manner. My focus is on the success of Royal Court in two aspects, one as a commercial product, and the other as a contribution to the design of CK3 as a whole. I've played just over 1,000 hours of CK3, and about 50 hours of Royal Court as of its release. I've tried out several playstyles, ranging from a roleplay focused playthrough as a romancing French knight, and I've taken on a full-on speedrun to create Beta Israel, among others. I've taken my time to come to conclusions that I believe will be informative for the audience, and helpful from a design standpoint for future CK3 expansions. But I'll add in to qualify here that I am no game designer, merely a player that wants CK3 to be the best that it can be. That being said, I believe that Royal Court does an excellent job adding to the game at a design level, and that it is an immensely positive addition to the game. It is unfortunately marred with bugs as of release, horribly marketed, overhyped, and most of all too expensive. I'll expand upon these thoughts as we go. For now, let's talk about what's new. We can broadly divide the additions from Royal Court and its accompanying free update into two categories, court stuff and culture stuff, with only one outlying feature to those two classifications. I'm first going to list out these features, then evaluate them afterwards once they've been laid out. Starting with the court stuff, the eponymous Royal Court has been added to the game in 3D. This courtroom features court artifacts that provide bonuses to the ruler of that court. All non-tribal, king, or emperor tier characters have access to their own court. Courts have a level of grandeur, which quantifies their level of luxury and is modified via artifacts, events, court language, and a gold sink in the form of amenities. Every court has an expected level of grandeur based on their realm size, with penalties for falling short of it and bonuses for exceeding it. The court will occasionally have events that the player must take a decision for, although they can also be ignored, in which case the bottom option of the event will always be picked. There are also minor titles associated with the court, some of which are accessible without a court. These minor titles range from simple court grandeur bonuses, like the court musician, to new interactions with other mechanics, like with the executioner. Cultures have been entirely revamped in the newest update of CK3, with each culture having a unique set of traditions at game start, which are chosen from a pool of universal options. These cultures evolve over time at the behest of their culture head, who can add new traditions or change existing ones for a hefty prestige cost, depending on how well the traditions fit into their ethos and environment. Characters can also hybridize their culture with another nearby one, mixing their traditions and pillars, as well as diverging from their current culture to create a new one that shares some things with it. Between cultures, there is a cultural acceptance percentage, which indicates how well the culture's people get along. It is influenced by the presence of a shared language, the hostile or friendly actions between rulers of these cultures, and shared faiths. Higher acceptance makes the negative opinion modifier for being a different culture lower, until at 100%, where there is no negative opinion whatsoever for being foreign. Each culture has a language, which can be learned. Learning a language cuts the foreigner penalty for cultures speaking that language in half, and lets a ruler with a court pick that language as their court language. Outside of culture and court, a personal inventory of artifacts has been added to the game, which includes 4 trinket slots, a weapon, a regalia, a crown, and armor. These items give modifiers to the character wearing them and can be crafted for money, stolen, dueled for, or captured in sieges. There's all the new mechanics, both paid for and free, summarized as concisely as possible. There are other minor changes, like the new character looks, new clothes, and changes to dread, but they're too minor to look at, so I'll be ignoring them for the most part. What I've listed above are the major changes to the game. Now that we know what's new, let's examine what succeeded and what failed, and examine each feature closely. First though, let's briefly talk about how to define success and failure for the purpose of this video. Before we begin, I have an announcement. The CK3 speedrunning community has a competition going on to get the best time for the Beta Israel achievement. My subscribers here will have seen all my runs as I continue to compete against others in the community to get the lowest time possible. You there watching, if you play CK3 and you want an opportunity for a VIP badge in my Twitch chat and a shoutout at the beginning of the next video, join the competition by joining the CK3 speedrunning Discord in the description of this video. If you can get a real-time run faster than 2 minutes, or an in-game time run shorter than 8 months, I'll give you the VIP badge and a shoutout. Let's look at success now. Measuring success. It's a difficult task. When examining a game like CK3, figuring out what success actually entails is pretty tough. As a video game, Crusader Kings 3's gameplay encompasses the development and continuation of the prestige and lineage for any given family name. That prestige is measured using splendor, and in that sense, this acts kind of as score for CK3. Therefore, it might seem obvious that gameplay which revolves around the production of splendor such that the player enjoys the process is the ultimate goal of CK3. I would argue that Simplistically speaking, this is correct. However, anyone who has played this game knows that producing splendor is far from the only goal in the game. The goal for some people is just to not lose, and for others it's to create an amazing story. There are many ways to measure success. However, I like to think that the developers of the game have put a mechanic like splendor into the game for the very purpose of it being a universal goal that all players strive for. The developer intention is for the player to obtain splendor, and the mechanics of the game mirror this, with successful families having more splendor at game start. At the same time, we as players are interested in more than just generating splendor. We want a unique story or a challenge, or something we can call our own on our path to splendor generation. Self-expression is at the core of CK3, and so it cannot be ignored. With that in mind, I'm going to somewhat arbitrarily decide that success for any given mechanic in this analysis will be measured by its ability to facilitate the generation of splendor, either directly or indirectly, in the most fun, interesting, and creative ways possible without compromising player expression. This is in line with my understanding of the developer intentions and the general player consensus about what makes CK3 fun to play. If you have other ideas for how to measure success, leave it in the comments and I might even reply to it. Let's start breaking things down. This section is the meat of the video, and also we'll talk extensively, perhaps even long-windedly, about each mechanic. If you want to see the analysis of a particular mechanic, feel free to skip around to the mechanic you want to see analyzed. Let's start with the royal court itself. Analyzing the court as a mechanic is difficult due to its multifaceted nature. We're going to examine each piece separately, then evaluate it as the sum of its parts. First, the grandeur system. Grandeur is a number that represents your court's fanciness, and as a quantification of an abstract concept, I like it. Knowing whether or not my court is held in high regard across the world, this idea is good. Its execution, however, reaches similar pitfalls to other mechanics in the game. In terms of my self-expression, grandeur is entirely meaningless. The decision on what amenities to fund is a simple formula. Do I value my money, or the specific benefits given to me by my court grandeur level? If the answer is money, I let my grandeur fall and weather the problems. If the answer is the benefits, then I spend my money. I don't feel any sense of personal attachment to my court, and this mostly has to do with how, regardless of grandeur, my court is always the same. Although visuals often aren't that important for a grand strategy, this particular case demands a level of player expression. The only control I have over my court is what I choose to display in it via my court artifacts. As a means of obtaining splendor for my dynasty, I cannot think of a more boring way to do it than via court grandeur. In essence, amenities are a slider, akin to army maintenance in EU4. I put it up when I want splendor and prestige, I put it down when I want money. This is content which is meaningless beyond its mechanical use. So how could we improve on grandeur? Well, we can improve it by giving it some sense of, well, grandeur. I know that sounds stupid, but when I have level 10 grandeur, I don't really feel like it. Sure, I'm gaining prestige and renown, but is that all grandeur is? A number? How will my artifacts become better because they've been in such a grand court? I see the amenities trying to have effects outside of being a slider at times, like how my servants make hunting better. I like that. More of that, please. How about if my grandeur is extremely high, and a nearby kingdom is low? The nobles of the neighboring kingdom could request me to place my family member on that throne, in the hopes that their new ruler will give them more amenities. That way, I'm being rewarded for my high grandeur with an opportunity to spread my dynasty, which is entirely up to me, and I can make gains in splendor by having my dynasty spread out more. I want to feel rewarded for my high grandeur in ways other than just numbers. Give me opportunities to increase my splendor as an active gameplay, not passive gains. Let's talk about court artifacts next. We have one of the most anticipated parts of Royal Court here, the artifacts. Specifically, the court artifacts, since those are a subsystem of the court itself. We're not going to talk about the inventory stuff yet. This is where most of the unique and interesting artifacts are, and these vary in how interesting they are. The unique ones, like the keys to the Kaaba or Justinian's crown, carry powerful modifiers and are interesting to look at, while the crafted and generated ones often are not. I think having court artifacts be powerful as items, and having these strong effects is good. Something unique and hard to obtain should have a worthwhile reward. I also like how these things can be stolen and restolen, creating a sense of mythos. The security of artifacts feels like it matters, so the player will do what they can to obtain them and protect them, all the while being rewarded with splendor as long as they succeed to do so. In this sense, core artifacts are a success. The only problem is that the non-unique ones, which compose the vast majority of artifacts, are practically meaningless for the most part. Getting an extra half prestige and 0.1 renown per month doesn't really even feel worth protecting when you can just make another one if the right inspiration appears. It feels pointless. How could we improve the core artifacts? I would love to see normal artifacts become more powerful and impressive based on the rulers that have them and the cultures that have them. Maybe every 50 years, an artifact can upgrade its rarity until it hits purple, which is the highest. Once it hits purple, it gains new modifiers based on the culture and the ruler that owns it, rather than gaining rarity. This would effectively turn it into a unique artifact. Artifacts that gain modifiers from rulers should have positive or negative gains depending on who it is. A sadistic ruler's sword should instill dread in the people at the cost of increased tyranny gain. How about if a truly awful ruler's sword could actually become cursed in some way and bring shame to the family, making me want to throw it away? With a system like this, I would feel like each artifact has some kind of meaning, that they are a living part of the world. For many artifacts in real life, the mythos around them is so immense that we could call the artifacts themselves characters in our world. They should be so in CK3 as well. In terms of specifics, I'm spitballing here, but a balanced team should decide how often and how powerfully these artifacts gain power. The last thing I'll say about artifacts is please give me a way to sell them, or a way to destroy them. I have way too many meaningless artifacts that just clutter my inventory in every game. I don't feel at all inspired to care about my artifacts, except those very few that actually mean something. And those are few and far between. Speaking of inspirations, I actually like this system at its core, but the current problem is that inspired courtiers are too common and do not produce anything special enough, often enough, to make them feel good to fund. Most often, I'll get some basic dresser to throw in the corner that I don't care about and just put because it's numerically superior to the other dresser I had commissioned a few days ago. How could we improve inspirations? Well, let me work with the inspired courtier to produce something unique to both of us. If my courtier wants to make a crown, they may have their design in mind, but I want to contribute in a way beyond just making it higher quality, as it is in the game currently. If my character is temperate and is making a crown, they should be able to ask for fewer gems on it, or they should be able to put their signature on it, which would give the item a modifier based around temperance, maybe extra piety, or some vassal opinion. This modifier should then be re-modified again by the courtier, who has their own idea of how to add it to the crown. They might entirely reject my contribution, or twist it into something else. My character wanted a crown that shows their temperance, but the inspired courtier is brave, so the crown ends up reducing friendly casualties as a way of showing temperance in battle, or something like that. Now obviously, such a dynamic system would be difficult to balance. It may even fall into a numbers game as well, but in combination with the idea of aging artifacts that gain power as they become more legendary, we can see artifacts that feel like a genuine reflection of both those who made them and the ones who used them. In particular, the sense of lineage and legacy, which is so dear to CK3, comes out strongly here. As an artifact continues to be passed down the family line, it will become emblematic of its owners and creators. Next up is minor titles. The last piece of the court worth talking about, really. This one's a mixed bag for me. Some of the titles I really enjoy, like the Executioner and the Jester. The Executioner opens up new ways to execute people for different benefits. This is genius to me. Holding a public execution for my subjects to increase control in my land feels awesome, and it feels like it makes sense, too. The Jester being able to cheer me up by embarrassing other courtiers and vassals gives me a genuine decision to make. Do I allow the Jester to embarrass people, relieving my stress, or do I curtail my Jester, ensuring they don't ruin my diplomatic relationships? It also helps that the events are pretty funny, let's be honest. Other titles like the Seneschal or the High Almoner are just numbers and a yawn. Assign the best person for the job, wait until they die so I can put a new one there, repeat ad nauseum. It's better than CK2 by a landslide, which had even less depth, but it ultimately shares the minor titles pitfall. It's a numbers game with no depth. How do we improve minor titles? Well, right now they're just based on aptitude, and to be honest, although I critique the system, to increase the complexity of the system is sort of just adding needless complexity. Sometimes, things are okay as they are, even if they're not in depth. I have one very specific change that I would love to see though. Minor titles should grant renown to the person holding them depending on how important the role is, and how much grandeur the court is in which they're serving. The bodyguards of the Byzantine Emperor should bring renown to their family for such a prestigious position. Imagine being a Swedish king and having a son in the Varangian Guard of the Roman Emperor that guards him personally every night. That's something I'd brag about the next thing meet for sure. This would incentivize me, as a player, to ensure that my family members are well educated so that they might earn positions in foreign courts, or even in my own court, that bring renown back to my family. I would have a vested interest in the education and maintenance of my family as a unit, becoming known for their skills in many fields. This adds yet another playstyle and a creative means of acquiring renown. Other than that, minor titles are, as in the name, minor, so let it be that way. To conclude, the pieces of the court that we broke down to sub-mechanics, my overall consensus is that the court itself is too lifeless. which is fitting given the uncanny valley effect many of the models in the court have. Ugh. These systems feel like numbers that are just added in for no real reason. Every system having to do with the court feels like an excuse to convert gold into a different modifier, which is a good way to give gold more utility, but it could have been so much more than this. I feel disappointed by the lack of player expression in what should be their unique court. I feel no sense of attachment to my court, no sense of attachment to the artifacts in it, and no attachment to the minor titles I hand out. I do, however, enjoy making my wife court jester. Thank you for that, Paradox. Let's move on to the culture changes, which I'm a lot more excited for. I will admit to my biases here, and say that all of the features coming with Royal Court, I had the most hype and expectations for the culture changes. To me, the culture system is spot on overall. Some of the traditions in the game are absolutely amazing in terms of their self-expression potential and their mechanical linking between developer intention and player expression. I'll be going over some of my favorites and why they're so good, as well as some of the not so good ones and why they fail. Let's look at the pillars of the culture changes, the pillars and ethos. Every culture has a set of options for their pillars and ethos that determine a few things like culture group and language. The ethos selection is a nice way to create a broadly specialized culture without being too restricting. I like that each one feels genuinely different from the other, and their modifiers feel valuable. The pillars, I think, are simple by design, and benefit from that simplicity. Assigning culture group to the heritage selection is very good for ensuring that the sense of grouping that cultures have by default isn't lost, despite all the new cultures that can appear. Assigning a language to a culture independent of its heritage is also a nice way to show a sense of assimilation without entirely erasing a culture's past, and is solid for both roleplay and gameplay reasons. Giving the martial custom decision to culture instead of religion is also a nice touch, and more accurately reflects the interactions between culture and religion. I particularly love the aesthetic system, since it allows me to mix and match what pieces of the culture around me that I want to bring in, and it lets the player feel a sense of uniqueness to their choice, even if only aesthetically. Overall, I'm happy with the pillars and ethos system. I don't have much to say about them because they're simple and well done. Paradox has avoided overcomplicating the system, and has done a good job of making it feel customizable for the player. I have no improvements to add for this. Let's look at traditions, which are the meat of the culture changes, and I must say, also a prime cut. The traditions range in quality from masterful to just kind of meh, but at least fun to roleplay. I've not found a tradition that I've looked at and felt that's just bad, but I have seen some that I like more than others for sure. When deciding how to grade the traditions, I very much so relied on the aforementioned measure of success from the beginning of the video to determine what was well designed and what wasn't, as well as through hours of playing myself to see what I was generally attracted to. Broadly speaking, every tradition can be classified into one of three categories: good mechanics, good roleplay, or both. There are very few in the both section, but all of them are good in at least one aspect. I'm going to discuss the traditions that I feel succeed in both aspects and discuss why they fit that category. Other traditions I will cover in a later video, so let's not inflate this video's length too much. This is the sort of thing that I'll likely end up having a differing opinion about from some of you viewers, so please do let me know what you think so I can learn about the player consensus. Thank you. Looking at the category of both, in no particular order, I'm starting with ruling caste. I enjoy the idea of ruling caste very much so, and its focus on the very real concept of a ruling culture lording it over a peasant culture. The mechanics it adds encourage the playstyle that it is trying to represent, with extra dread coming out of tyranny, and an easier time both avoiding and putting down rebellions. I would change one thing at ruling caste though, and that is that it should eliminate entirely, or perhaps partially, the cultural acceptance penalty from characters in your realm. You are the ruling caste after all, so the people below you ought to view you as a ruler, regardless of their own culture. Next up is tribal unity. I think tribal unity makes the sense of family loyalty that was often so integral to tribes in real life feel encouraged by its mechanics. By making the player gain something for keeping their titles in the family, they encourage inter-house politics, and also make the creation of a cadet branch more meaningful. When one of my sons decides to become the head of his own house, I no longer am incentivized to give him land, which could create a sense of house rivalry. That storytelling aspect of the tradition, in combination with the mechanical drive behind it, is awesome to play around with. Although, to be honest, the AI doesn't always play ball. Sometimes they'll just kind of do their own thing and not really care about you abandoning them. Next up is culture blending. For those cultures that mostly acclimate to the ones around them, this tradition does a good job of encouraging it, although I will say that it does make it easier to do. I had a lot of doubt about putting it in the both category, but ultimately chose to because it does encourage a playstyle through a mechanical change, if only a shallow one. So this one's kind of an edge case. Another good one is Battlefield Looters. I very much enjoy this mechanic because it feels like a way to obtain more cash at a cost, which can reflect the priorities of my culture's people. When I choose Battlefield Looters, it's because I need more money, and I fight enough that I can reasonably expect to make money from my battles. I'm also willing to pay the mechanical cost of my prestige to make that happen, which reflects the story of my dishonorable looter culture very well. The only thing I'd change is make it give a little more gold. Right now it's underpowered. Bump it to 2 or 3 gold per 100 casualties. Going well with battlefield looters is recognition of talent. I love this one. Making the recruitment of prisoners actually provide a useful benefit beyond their own stats is awesome. It feels really cool to capture a 20 prowess knight and then recruit him for your own military. You can even lend him land later. And because you have that strong hook from recruiting him, he'll be fiercely loyal to you, as well as being useful. I like the mechanics of this tradition play into the storytelling it creates masterfully. I want to see more stuff like this. Fitting in really nicely with the previous tradition is Only the Strong. This was another iffy one for me, but I like that the personal interaction of choosing your knights becomes more important with this tradition. It just needs a little more push to be a flawless piece for me. The way it changes how the player constructs their army is nice, but it should have more effect outside of just the actual battles. How about the ability to duel for titles, like what some tribal characters get? That way, I get the power of my super knights, but if I'm a weak dueler myself, I'll be dethroned by one of them. That would make this tradition flawless to me and provide it with a cool narrative background to its mechanics. Another edge case for me is Quarrelsome. Much like Only the Strong, this tradition needs something outside of just battles to make it more interesting as a whole. How about making my vassals more likely to join factions, or allowing a war of honor between people that share this culture? Let me go to war just for the sake of it without taking any land, as a way to prove that I'm better than someone. How about let me go to war over crimes like adultery? If someone sleeps with my wife, let me declare war on them to imprison them or at least humiliate them. That would bring out the truly quarrelsome nature of the people at the nobility level, as well as than just a mechanic. I reluctantly place this one in the both category because of the control loss that does show how the people of this culture do not get along well, but it remains something of an edge case. I think these changes would really help it. Another good one is Malleable Invaders. I really enjoy this one for its ability to make me feel like an invader who really does just care about their own success. If adopting the new traditions of my conquered land makes it easier to rule and exploit for money, then yeah, why not? I feel that my decision as ruler to adapt is encouraged by the mechanics of Malleable Invaders, and therefore I'm happy with it. Next up is An Eye for an Eye. This one is lots of fun with the interactions it can build, especially if you're playing a particularly war-free campaign as a vassal. Focusing on getting back at your rivals and having it eased is great, but I have one change for this tradition that would make it flawless. Give me renown when I succeed in a hostile scheme against a rival. That alone would catapult this tradition into flawlessness for me, since then, the mechanics don't just help you accomplish your goals, they reward you for achieving them as well. On the other side of An Eye for an Eye is Loyal Subjects. This one is not so much fun to play as, but rather to play with. I don't want to be a culture with loyal subjects, but I thoroughly enjoy placing loyal subject rulers into my realm as a way to keep my stability. This one is weird in that it actually doesn't fulfill my criteria to be a good tradition on its own, but its interaction with other cultures as a sort of subservient, favored culture is fun as a conqueror. It could be improved upon by making hostile actions against loyal subjects incur heavier tyranny. That way, I might even choose to play as loyal subject culture to disincentivize my liege from acting against me. For now, it's only fun to play with, not play as. On the other end of loyal subjects once again is Chivalry. This one is very fun to play as, and having it around is kind of annoying. It's one of the top tier traditions because of how it masterfully encourages the usage of a mechanic through rewarding its usage and making cool stories out of its usage. I did an entire roleplay campaign on stream where I played a chivalrous French knight that romanced every famous lady he could imagine, and it was a blast. At the same time, I racked up lots of renown, which allowed me to actually progress in the game at a basic level, making my dynasty quite famous without actually doing any conquest. I was able to make a legacy out of just romance, and that felt amazing. Very different from Chivalry is Practiced Pirates. It's a great inclusion into the game because of how it allows a culture to remain belligerent towards its neighbors even after settling down, without making it completely broken. The fact that I lose prestige for raiding has a similar feeling to Battlefield Looters, where I can engage in this mechanic, but the negatives associated with it make more sense for how my culture views the activity. They're not proud to be raiding as a civilized people, but they recognize the necessity of it, so they do it, and they pay the price for it. Another fun mechanic is Trials by Combat. Adding in an entire mechanic that suits the roleplay aspect is wonderful. I enjoy being able to duel for honor and punish criminals this way, and it feels suitable for how some cultures treat criminality, particularly in combination with traditions like Only the Strong. Trials by Combat feels like an awesome way to incentivize the player to have a martial society without simply providing buffs to their stats. Playing as a low prowess character is genuinely more dangerous with Trials by Combat than it would be without it, so it adds more depth. Moving away from combat and war in general is Culinary Artists. Being able to garner dynastic fame for things beyond war is something I always approve of, and what better way to do that than by having famous cuisine? The additional gold cost of feasts feels like a reasonable cost for being able to project your dynasty's fame using food. I enjoy the roleplay aspect of a culture that focuses in on food and the delicacies of life, and I enjoy that mechanically. I am encouraged to do that by picking this tradition. If I'm in war too much, I won't have money for my feasts, and therefore I'll be less famous in the world stage. Beautifully done. Moving over to something that's a little less nice than food, is merciful blindings. As a mechanic, it's not hugely useful, but the piety gain is something. It should be more though. I think the way to make merciful blindings better as a mechanic level would be to just apply disinherited to any character who is blinded by someone of this culture. That way you can effectively eliminate a threat by blinding them, which is rewarded by the tradition rather than having to execute them, which may incur tyranny. The trade-off is that you don't get any dread from blinding compared to executing. The last one I want to highlight for today is Byzantine traditions. This tradition is based on something that merciful blindings should have been, but more focused. The fact that negative physical traits on characters makes them not able to push claims is good to incentivize the blinding and castrating, of course, but the only problem is how it only applies to people of that culture, rather than being usable on others. I love the idea of castrating a Turkish invader to make sure he never comes back, but that only works if the Turkish guy also adopts Byzantine traditions. Besides that, I do like this tradition, and I think its mechanics encourage roleplay as well. There are other good ones out there, but this is my list of the ones that I think future traditions should model themselves after. Although not every tradition can be my favorite, they should all measure up to the standards set by the best, and some of them simply failed to do that, or they're just uninteresting. I'll have a video discussing all the traditions in the game up in a little while if you're interested in those. I'll announce it on my Discord and on my stream. Feel free to check those out. Let's talk about hybrid cultures and divergent cultures. I'm going to discuss them together because the mechanics are very similar, and also both are part of the paid DLC mechanics. Hybrid cultures are certainly cool at an overarching level. I like mixing cultures and choosing the aesthetics and traditions, but they have a few flaws. The main one is how hybrid cultures absolutely ruin technology as a game mechanic, since the hybrid cultures take on all innovations from both cultures. I'm genuinely not sure how to fix it is the worst part. Maybe a system which decides which innovations get carried forward based on how many traditions and pillars were taken from each culture. If at least half the traditions and pillars are from one culture, you get all their innovations. Something like that could work. But ultimately, innovation is such a small part of the game that it's a relatively small gripe. To sum up for hybrid cultures, they're lots of fun, but they break that one aspect of the game. Divergent cultures to me are perfect in implementation. Being able to change cultures at the cost of prestige by simply making a new one that swaps out an ethos or a language or maybe a few traditions feels really fun, and best of all, the AI does it too, so you can end up with lots of little subcultures that make for interesting AI interactions depending on what they take. Every game gets a little more of a unique feeling with the system, and it truly makes every game its own since the AI doesn't pick the same traditions every time. Even if the AI doesn't diverge, they tend to add different traditions via reforming their culture pretty consistently. I rarely see the exact same cultural traditions, although some are more popular than others. I'm very happy with how divergent cultures work and wouldn't change a thing about them. In particular, the ability to change the restrictions on divergent cultures in the game rules is a great touch to allow players to decide how they want their games to go. One last note about cultures I will touch on is learning languages and cultural acceptance. These two things are simple and well done. I want to really emphasize how important it is sometimes to just leave something simple. Language learning could have been a very bloated system, but instead it's kept simple, which I really appreciate from a player convenience standpoint. Although there are some funny events for not knowing languages, for the most part, it's fine to ignore the system if you want, and at the same time, it's fun to go ahead and learn them. When I forget to make my kids learn languages, I don't facepalm feeling like I made a horrific mistake, but I also don't feel like it would have been a waste of my time to make them learn. Cultural acceptance as well is awesome. Being able to have a genuinely multicultural empire or kingdom is a change I'm really happy to see in CK3, since previously, having a completely homogenous realm was not just the best way to play, but kind of the only way. There was no benefit to having a local ruler culture that wasn't outweighed by that negative foreigner modifier. Now though, controlling popular opinion through decentralized rule feels viable and effective, as well as roleplay friendly. Now that we broke down everything and examined it with a fine-tooth comb, I want to talk about my thoughts and feelings in regards to Royal Court. This is going to be a little more on off-the-cuff section, although it is still scripted. I was extremely hyped for Royal Court, perhaps even too much so, and having played it a lot now, I need to say this. The content is good, awesome even, but my god, this product was marketed awfully. The Royal Court itself is the least interesting, least fleshed out, and overall just least impressive part of this entire update in DLC. When you get for the price of admission in Royal Court, is not worth it at the current price, nor would it be at even half the current price, to be honest. Funnily enough though, the free update has content that I would say warrants a $25 price tag. Maybe not quite 30 bucks, but all the culture stuff is amazing. If Paradox had flipped this DLC around and made the free update be the court, with the DLC covering all the culture changes, this DLC would suddenly be much less disappointing. As someone who loves this game, I have to say that Royal Court as a piece outside of its commercial background is amazing, with some hiccups. I never expect perfection, and if I'm being honest, I didn't think the court would be all that exciting, since the 3D court looked extremely uncanny valley since the first images of it were put up. I have to say though, the lack of depth and lack of interesting choices to make with regards to Royal Court is astounding. I would have expected much more for this kind of cash, this kind of weight, and for this kind of game and studio. I would have expected the kind of depth that we get with the Fleur de Lis update. It's extremely ironic to me that Royal Court should be so disappointing due to its lack of depth in comparison to its free update when looking at the normal Paradox way of doing things. I'm used to CK2 DLC and EU4 DLC, where the vast majority of mechanics are in the DLC, and the free update provides a few infrastructural changes to support those changes. At a design level, Royal Court and Fleur de Lis bring CK3 to a new height, and I genuinely believe that. The new things you can do in CK3 really do revitalize the game, but I cannot possibly say that Royal Court is worth its cost. It's extremely overpriced. Another thing I have to say is how bad all the bugs and general lack of polish are in this update. The diplomatic requests never go away. There are grammar errors in the court events. I constantly get events that show the wrong modifiers. For example, in sparring with knights, I constantly am being robbed of artifacts and then losing a completely different one. I rob other people's artifacts and end up getting an entirely different one pretty often. The DLC feels rushed despite its delay. This update feels rushed, but at the same time, the actual mechanics are so good that I'm still happy despite the lack of polish, but the precedent this sets for CK3 is worrying. I know Paradox needs Royal Court to do well, and that they were out of time, but please do not rush these sorts of things. The details mean everything in a game like CK3, they really do. I have a feeling that the 3D assets for the court took a long time to make, and the sad thing is that they're one of the least interesting and most seemingly lazy parts of the DLC. The fact that the Kinderkrone and the Iron Crown of Lombardy look nothing like their real-life counterparts is fine. But what's worse is that most unique artifacts are just boxes that supposedly contain their item. That's a clear sign of laziness or time crunch, which frustrates me. I sincerely hope that Paradox did not put their employees under really bad conditions for this DLC. I really do. I wanted a lot from Royal Court. I know, I had huge expectations, and many of those were not met. But if I step back and try to examine the DLC from outside of my hype and biases, I think it's a competent DLC with many hiccups. I think the problem lies in a rushed development cycle and a need to appeal to a wider audience, since most people got pretty hyped about the 3D courtroom. Paradox chose to market that better than anything else. In some ways, much of the casual player base actually reported they love the DLC, that they enjoy the 3D models, but the more dedicated player base certainly has been more mixed. In terms of future improvements, I can only speak from a non-business perspective because I don't know about the commercial requirements for Paradox to keep running as a company. From a design perspective, Royal Court feels empty, although its patch accompanying it feels full. The price to pay for this barren DLC is massive, and needs to be reduced for the player base to feel okay with it. In conclusion, I don't think Paradox's reputation has been heavily damaged by Royal Court, but it certainly has been a mediocre and underwhelming release. With a few patches, the bugs will go away, and with a few more, maybe certain mechanics can be better balanced. The DLC does a good job of setting up a platform for future DLCs and flavor packs, and at this point, I'm excited to see what Flavor Pack 2 will do. If they can build off of the already implemented mechanics nicely, and keep new interesting ones coming for reasonable prices, then I have lots of hope for CK3 as a game in the future. Let me know down in the comments what you think of what I said here. I'd love to discuss. Did you like Royal Court? What traditions are your favorites? Are you hopeful for future DLCs and flavor packs? I'll reply to most comments, so please do leave some down there. Consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed the video. Check out my Twitch for live speedruns and playthroughs of CK3, as well as language lessons and POG content in general. Join my Discord if you want to chat, just about anything really, and I hope to see you guys there. Peace out.